We are at that time of year. Free agency is over and the NFL draft is approaching. How did the Jets do giving out contracts? And who should they be focusing on in the upcoming draft? We'll talk about all of this and more on today's mailbag edition of the Locked On Jets podcast.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Wednesday, April 6th, 2022, and I'm your host, John B. from GanggreenNation.com, thanking you for making this show your first listen or your first watch every day, as we are free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. If you like what you see or hear, hit that subscribe button and you'll never miss an episode. And if you're watching on YouTube, please give this episode a thumbs up. It helps other Jets fans find the channel and it helps us out tremendously. Today we have our weekly mailbag show. Each Wednesday we do a mailbag, or at least we try to. Some weeks we can't. Some weeks we have to move it to a different day. But today we're doing it normal. We're having our mailbag show on Wednesday. And thank you so much for everybody who sent in questions. Our first question is focused on the NFL draft. Which of the wide receiver prospects is your favorite? Well, you know, as much as you figure out favorites, it's also about figuring out who's a good fit, because every receiver prospect brings a different skill set to the table. You know, Garrett Wilson's bringing you something different from Drake London, who's bringing you something different from Treylon Burks, who's bringing you something different from Jameson Williams. So for the Jets, what I think they need is, I think they need somebody who's going to be able to step in on day one and be able to contribute. Because right now, this group that you've got of Corey Davis and Elijah Moore and Braxton Berrios, those are your three starters. And I think you'd have to say that that's near the bottom of the league. So you're going to need somebody who steps in on day one and makes an immediate impact. And to me, I would guess that's probably Garrett Wilson. The thing with Garrett Wilson is, I understand that, like, I kind of have come to hate the expression high floor, because I've seen lots of high floor prospects fail. So when I think of high floor, it doesn't necessarily mean that the guy's guaranteed to be a decent player. But I think the odds are better that Garrett Wilson's going to be at least a decent player than it is for pretty much anybody else in this draft class at the receiver position. There are always scenarios where things just don't work out, but because of his route running, because of his speed, because of everything he brings to the table, I think the odds of him being a complete zero in the NFL are probably lower than they are the other prospects in this class. And that route running he brings to the table, that to me suggests he's probably going to be the best bet to be able to contribute, at least in some fashion, year one. And his ability to create with the ball in his hands. You know, he's also a guy who's pretty good in space because of his ability to change directions. I mean, he makes guys miss. So you'll be able to design a package of plays for him, kind of like the way you do with Elijah Moore or Braxton Berrios, where you just throw them the ball in space and you let them make plays. Maybe you run a screen and you get some blockers out in front of him. And that's something that makes the life easier for a quarterback, because entering year two, you want to put Zach Wilson in as few positions as possible where he has to stand tall in the pocket, scan the entire field, and find the open receiver. Now, he's got to do it. He can't, it can't be a situation where he's doing that 0% of the time, but you want to lower the percentage of the time he needs to do that. And that's been one of the problems with Jets offenses, not just with Zach Wilson, but, going back to Sam Darnold, a lot of these young quarterbacks we've had here through the years, where there just hasn't been enough talent on the team to take the playmaking load off the quarterback. And especially when you're first entering the NFL, you want to ask as little of your quarterback as possible. And so part of that is finding guys who can create in space. Part of it's also just finding guys who can create separation. And I think Garrett Wilson kind of brings that to the table. So to me, he's probably the best fit. I'm not sure he's the best receiver, because all these guys could be really good. Drake London brings a certain element to the table that the Jets lack, his ability to go up and win contested catches. So there's a little element of that. I don't think he's going to be as good as Wilson in the NFL. Now, if you look at like Drake London's college production, you'll say, well, he's also pretty good in the open field. I'm a little skeptical Drake London's going to be as dynamic in the open field in the NFL as he was in college, because I'm not sure he's as fast. I'm not sure he's as athletic. I think a lot of what happened in college with Drake London is just he's bigger than everybody, and I think defenders in the NFL are stronger, so they're going to have an easier time bringing him down. I think Drake London. I don't think Drake London's going to be a total zero in the open field in the NFL, but I don't think he's going to be the kind of guy you're going to design a ton of screens for. I go back and forth on it, but I feel like I've kind of landed on the idea that maybe Drake London's not the guy you design those touches for. I think there's another thing to note, though, because we know who the Jets tried to trade for recently. That was Tyreek Hill. And the Jets gave up quite a package to try and get Tyreek Hill. I mean, they were sending all 3 of their day 2 picks to Kansas City. And the deal was done, actually. And then Miami got involved, apparently, and the Chiefs gave Tyreek Hill a chance to pick his team, and he chose Miami. So you look at this, who was the receiver the Jets really tried to get? That was Tyreek Hill. Whose skill set matches best with Tyreek Hill? That's Jameson Williams, probably. Guy with just a lot of speed. He's not just, Jameson Williams is not just a speed guy, though. He brings more to the table than that. This is not just a guy who runs fast in a straight line. He's also, I think he's also quick in a short space. So I feel like he's probably the guy who skill set matches up best with the player the Jets tried to acquire. Of course, he's coming off a torn ACL, which he suffered in the national championship game, which complicates things to a certain degree. And had he not suffered that injury, there's a very good chance he's the first wide receiver off the board this year. I mean, there's a chance we're talking about him at either 4 or 10, and maybe we still are. And to be honest with you, and I don't know the exact medicals, but I think we know in this day and age the injury the injury Jameson suffered is not necessarily one that's going to prevent him from having a very successful NFL career. It's more a question right now of what are you going to get year one, and we don't know the exact timeline, but I think if you draft Jameson Williams, you pretty much have to expect that you're not going to get a lot year one, and anything he gives you would be kind of a bonus because we're not sure he's going to be ready for training camp. In addition to learning all the normal stuff you have to learn as you're entering the NFL, you're also rehabbing. So it's going to be tough to ask Jameson Williams to do much this year. Now, long term, he could be a player for you. Long term, I would not be surprised if he was a very good player in this league. And I'm not really scared by the injury from the standpoint that I think it's going to prevent him from being an excellent NFL player. I think it's just more from the standpoint that Jets kind of need an immediate impact because of the way they've approached this offseason. They still have a pretty big hole at wide receiver. And, almost every NFL team, we talk about having holes. Almost every NFL team has some sort of hole entering the season. It's just for where the Jets are as a team, with this quarterback entering year 2 and needing all the help he can get. Wide receiver is not really a spot the Jets have the luxury of entering the 2022 season with a hole in. So that's what you have to consider. I think for the Jets, it's not necessarily that I like him a lot better than these other prospects. I just think for the Jets where they are right now, Garrett Wilson's probably the best option. He probably meshes best with what the Jets really need. But, all these other guys bring something to the table. So it's kind of difficult to say. And I think when you're talking near the top of the draft, frequently it's not about who's better. It's about which skill set do you want. So I hope that answered the question for you. Our next question, also about the wide receiver position. No surprise there that everybody's focused on wide receiver. What do you think about passing on the consensus top 3 receivers and using a late first-round pick that would be acquired by trading up on Christian Watson of North Dakota State or Jahan Dotson of Penn State? My contention is that these players are just as likely to be stars as the others, that there's not much difference between them. Well, that comes down to your individual evaluation. I guess, it's always possible. You see plenty of times that guys who are drafted late first round or second round end up being better than guys who are drafted high in the first round. So, and there's a lot that goes into it. The situation you land in, I think sometimes we underestimate how important that can be, the type of instruction you receive, whether or not you're used in a way that accentuates your skill set. These are all things that really make a big difference when we talk about draft picks, even early guys. I think sometimes we just forget about these. We're quick to label somebody a success. We're quick to label somebody a bust. And we don't really consider the context of which they're working in. So, it's entirely possible that somebody like a Watson out of North Dakota State or somebody like a Dotson out of Penn State ends up being the best receiver in the class. It would not be the first time something like this happened. And if the Jets like have these guys as equal or better to the consensus top three, then that makes a ton of sense. I mean, I can't. I think sometimes we look at these big boards that the media puts out, and we think that these things cannot be questioned. But sometimes the media big boards do not match up with the way teams evaluate these prospects. Sometimes there's a player who's in the NFL, among NFL teams rated much higher than he is among the media, and there are times where the media overestimates how high a player is going to be drafted, and NFL teams are not nearly as high on the player. So it's always difficult to say. Again, I go back to what I just said in the first question. Wide receiver is not a position the Jets are in a luxury to have a hole in entering week 1 this season. They need it addressed. There are certain positions where you can live with it if it's still not addressed, because again, not every hole is going to be filled. Even playoff teams have weaknesses. So, we enter the offseason, we say the Jets need to fill all of these. They don't really need to fill all of these needs, but there are certain needs that are more pressing than others. And I think wide receiver is up there. I think wide receiver is like the one spot I look at this and I say the Jets cannot enter this season without addressing it, without getting impact right away. So with that in mind, if they have Watson, if they have Dotson rated as high as these guys or better, then I think that's a strategy that makes some degree of sense. But I don't think if these guys are rated lower, then that strategy works for me, because I think you need to increase your odds as much as possible at wide receiver. So if you have these guys a little bit lower, I think you've got to go with Wilson or London or Williams. I just think it's too much of a priority. At a different position, I could see the argument. I just don't think so at wide receiver. Now, of course, there are other positions than wide receiver that the Jets will be looking at addressing this offseason. And we also have to talk a little bit about what they've done in free agency. How has Joe Douglas's approach been? And we'll talk about all of these things as our Locked On Jets Wednesday mailbag continues. Of course, as we talk about the NFL draft, that means spring is here and summer is right around the corner, and you want to make sure you have great sunglasses this summer. You should know that Shady Rays is an independent sunglass company that gives you the features of $200 sunglasses for a fraction of the price. That means polarized lenses, well-constructed durable frames, and premium high-end finishes. Also, something you won't find anywhere else is Shady Rays' insane protection program. Shady Rays includes lost and broken protection on every pair. They will send you a brand new pair if you lose them, no matter what happened. Give them a try, and if you don't love them, you'll pay nothing. It's as simple as that. Plus, 10 meals are donated to fight hunger in America when you shop with Shady Rays. Exclusively for our listeners, head to shadyrays.com and use code LOCKEDON to get 50% off 2 or more pairs of polarized sunglasses. Again, that's code LOCKEDON. It's one word with no space, LOCKEDON, for their best deal of the season. 50% off 2 or more pairs of Shady Rays sunglasses, backed by over 150,000 verified 5-star reviews. Thank you again for making Locked On Jets your first listen or your first watch every day. We're free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. If you like what you see or hear, please give this episode a thumbs up. Let's continue with our weekly mailbag. Our next question: how likely do you think it still is that the Jets will trade for a player like a Danielle Hunter or A.J. Brown? Do you think it's likely, and who do you think it will be? Well, I never think a trade is likely. I think that it seems to me that for every 100 players who are discussed as trade possibilities, maybe one of them get traded. There are always rumors whenever a player is having a difficult time with a contract, and everybody remembers the Jamal Adamses who actually get traded, but more often there's some sort of agreement that's worked out, or the player just ends up hitting free agency. So I don't think it's going to happen. Danielle Hunter, the buzz is now out of Minnesota. They're keeping him. There was a certain deadline where money became guaranteed or something along those lines, and that has passed. So it sounds like Minnesota's going to keep Hunter. You can certainly hope for an A.J. Brown or a DK Metcalf to become available, and the way the wide receiver market has changed, how expensive wide receivers have come, maybe it's a little bit more likely at the receiver position, which would be good for the Jets, because there may be some team out there that was banking on keeping their star receiver and it being a little bit cheaper, and now this offseason has completely changed the market. So I think it's always possible, but I think the odds of a trade are typically pretty overrated. It usually doesn't happen it doesn't happen that frequently in the NFL. If it does happen, though, if a wide receiver becomes available, Jets certainly should be in on it. Our next question: besides not acquiring a number one receiver, what move did Joe Douglas make this offseason that did not make sense? Our next question: besides not acquiring a number one wide receiver, what move could come back to haunt Joe Douglas this offseason? Well, I think it may be a move he didn't make, and there are plenty of things that I could point to where I say I don't know about Joe Douglas's approach here, but I really disagree with his views on the linebacker position for the Jets right now, because if you read what the people close to the team have to say, it sounds like they really love the linebackers that they have in C.J. Mosley and Quincy Williams. And I think that's a weakness. I don't think it's the type of weakness that destroys you. I think it's fine if, like, you're strong everywhere else. If you've got a great defensive line and a great secondary, these are linebackers you can live with. But those guys made a lot of mistakes last season. And based on what I've read, it's almost like the Jets blame the defensive line for the linebacker problems. And I don't think that they're right about that. Now, it's not like wide receiver where there are specific guys you say that guy would have been a great fit. I mean, there are a couple guys who I thought would have been okay. It's not so much any player that they failed to land. It's more that they just had no interest because they think that they're great at the linebacker position. And I think that that's really wrong. And there's an irony in this because Mike Maccagnan was like obsessed with bringing in linebackers. It was like his number one priority almost every offseason he was with the Jets. And he had coaches in Todd Bowles and Greg Williams where linebacker play really wasn't a premium in those defensive schemes. I mean, with Greg Williams, he was here 2 years, and because of injuries and because of various other factors, Neville Hewitt ended up playing most of the time at linebacker. Neville Hewitt was a starting linebacker for the Jets, and Neville Hewitt wasn't great, but he wasn't the reason when the defense failed. He wasn't the reason the defense failed. And in 2019, the defense had success despite having Neville Hewitt. But Mike Maccagnan was obsessed with linebackers, even though the defense didn't really need them. Now you have Robert Saleh, where you're running a scheme where linebacker is really important, and it's like there's no urgency at all. There's no sense that we got to do something to make sure we have top-notch linebacker play. I think it's very confusing, and I don't agree with their assessment that they're in great shape at the linebacker position. I think that that's an area that could come back to bite the Jets. Our next question is from Peter. While Douglas has been lauded for his two new tight end signings, I can't help but think that Belichick signed Hunter Henry and Jonnu Smith 1 year earlier to help his rookie quarterback. Was Douglas a little late to the party? I think Douglas was a little late to the party. Do you agree? Well, I don't think that there's any way you can defend what Joe Douglas did at tight end in 2021. They acted last offseason like tight end was not important. And that's fine if you're running an offense that tight end doesn't matter in. But it was obvious once the season began that Mike LaFleur really wanted to use two tight end sets. So you look back at what the Jets did in free agency, and you say, well, why weren't the Jets in on some of these guys? And Hunter Henry, I wanted at the time. Jonnu Smith, I think, was a bit of a disappointment for New England, so I can't really get upset over that one. Hunter Henry was a guy who would have interested me if I were the Jets. But I look back at this, it seems like there was definitely a disconnect there. It doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. And, if you're running a bunch of two tight end sets and you've got Tyler Kroft and Ryan Griffin, there's not really a lot of logic to that. Why weren't you more aggressive? I looked at that at the beginning of the season, and I remember seeing that the Jets had so little invested at the tight end position, yet they wanted to run these two tight end sets all the time. And I was like, well, if you were so obsessed with it, why didn't you add tight ends? Where was the disconnect there? Because it's not like LaFleur and Douglas never spoke. You would think that LaFleur made it clear that he wanted to run two tight end sets a lot. So it was just very odd because you would have thought it wasn't a case where the Jets tried to sign somebody. It didn't seem like they were really that active in the tight end market last year. It's not a case where they brought in a big money guy and it did not work. That at least would show, okay, maybe we swung and missed, but we tried to upgrade the tight end position. Very odd how it worked last offseason. And this year you saw a little bit of a course correction where the Jets did sign two tight ends because, look, LaFleur wants to run two tight ends pretty frequently. So, yeah, I agree with you. I don't think Douglas handled the tight end position very well in 2021. I think very, very puzzling how it was handled. And I think there was a lot to be desired there. Our weekly mailbag is not over yet. We'll have a few more questions. We'll talk about the Carl Lawson signing last year, and we'll also talk about draft strategy. That's ahead here on this Wednesday mailbag edition of Locked On Jets. Of course, we're all hoping Joe Douglas does a great job in the upcoming NFL draft, and if he does well enough, maybe we should give him a Built Bar as a present. Built Bar is the best tasting protein bar on the market. The bars are absolutely delicious. They're covered in 100% chocolate. At Built Bar, they're all about the taste. They make it taste delicious first, then they figure out how to make it healthy. I don't know how they do it, but they pull it off every time. You've got so many delicious flavors. You've got mint brownie, coconut almond, white chocolate cookies and cream. And again, these bars are healthy. Most bars only have 130 calories, 4 grams of sugar, 4 net carbs, and 17 grams of protein. Just compare that to a candy bar, which usually has around 240 calories, 30 grams of sugar, and dozens of net carbs. Go to Built.com. You can check out all the flavors available, decide which one you want for yourself, and use promo code LOCK15 at checkout. Again, that's promo code LOCK15. It's one word with no space, LOCKED, number 1, number 5, for 15% off at Built, BUILT.com for delicious Built bars. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Mailbag Wednesday show. Our next question. While I was pleased with the Carl Lawson signing, and Douglas cannot be blamed for the misfortune of the preseason injury, nobody seems to comment on the fact that Cincinnati jettisoned Lawson in favor of Trey Hendrickson, who the Jets could have signed, and Hendrickson had a monster year. Likewise, Matthew Judon ranked 9th with 12.5 sacks. I thought Joe Douglas was so well connected to the Ravens organization that he might have the inside track. Your thoughts? I think that these criticisms would speak more to me in a world where Carl Lawson played and underperformed. But I don't think you can compare Carl Lawson's season to like these other guys when he missed the entire season with an injury. So like if Carl Lawson went out there and had 3 sacks, then I think you could fairly point to this and say, well, we could have signed these other guys. But we don't know the kind of season Carl Lawson had. It's very possible Carl Lawson could have had like a 10-sack season. In fact, I think that's what the Jets were banking on. I know Lawson has not put up big sack totals through his career, but there were some fundamentals there. Just the rate he's getting pressures that suggest he was a little unlucky in Cincinnati with his sack totals. I think the Jets were kind of banking on him having that kind of season. And without having seen him in action, I think it's very difficult to say that the Jets made a mistake. And I think Judon was not really a great fit for the Jets scheme anyway. So I think, he probably is a better fit for what New England did. Hendrickson will be the guy he's compared to because obviously Hendrickson was Lawson's replacement in Cincinnati. So if Lawson comes out next season and only has like 2 sacks and Hendrickson has another big year, then yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of criticism. I think it'll probably be fair, but this isn't a case where a guy underperformed. If a guy underperforms and like there was another option at a different position whose old team took on, then yeah, I think you can absolutely get on the GM over that. But I think we need more time here. Listen, by the end of next season, it might be a very fair point to make. If Hendrickson posts another 13 sacks and Lawson struggles, then I think we're at the point where we can say, well, Joe Douglas made a bad decision there. But I think it's a little early for that just because Lawson didn't play. And it's not like the Jets could have foreseen Lawson's injury. I mean, listen, for all we know, if the Jets had signed Hendrickson, he may have been the guy that got hurt in Green Bay. And maybe Lawson had stayed in Cincinnati. And we'd be saying, well, why didn't we sign Lawson? Coming off a Super Bowl. So I think it's very difficult to say. I would withhold judgment. I'm not completely saying Joe Douglas is in the clear here, but I'm going to withhold judgment until I see more. And our last question. I would be happy if the Jets landed Kayvon Thibodeau and Sauce Gardner with picks 4 and 10, but only if they draft 2 other wide receivers by the end of day 2. Would you rather use pick 10 on one of the top wide receivers, or would you rather grab Thibodeau and Sauce Gardner and then draft 2 other receivers in either the 2nd or 3rd rounds? Well, it's an interesting question, and the way I view it is there are multiple paths to success in the NFL, so I never like to say you have to draft somebody here, a specific player, because you never know. There might be a guy in the 2nd round who ends up better than the guy you draft in the 1st round. I would say this. If the Jets are not going to draft a receiver in the 1st round, I would like to see them at least double their odds in rounds 2 and round 3 by drafting 2 receivers. Even if the Jets draft a receiver at 4 and 10, I really would not hate it. In fact, I would almost prefer it that they drafted a wide receiver in either rounds 2 or 3. So I'd love to leave these first 3 rounds with 2 wide receivers, and you got 5 picks in the first 2 rounds, so you do have the mechanism to make that happen. So Yeah, listen, I mean, I think like if we're talking scenarios where I'd be okay with leaving round one without a receiver, that would probably be it. If you got Kayvon Thibodeau and you got Sauce Gardner, and then you decided to double dip, because then, even though you can't really expect a second round pick or a third round pick to contribute immediately, the odds are against it. Then you at least have given yourself twice as high odds. So I guess I could, that's one of those situations where long run, even though I've been very adamant that the Jets need to draft a receiver in the first round, I can appreciate the long-term value there of adding those pieces to the defense. And in the short run, at least you've given yourself a shot with two receivers by the end of day two. With those three day two picks where you've got 2 second-rounders and a third-rounder. If you use two of them on receiver, then you've at least given yourself kind of a fighting chance. And even though the receiver position is still not ideal, there's a lot of long-term value for building this team up. So I could live with it. My preference probably still take a receiver in the first round. I think the question is, would you prefer? I'd still prefer taking a receiver in the first round. But the Jets did it that way. This defense is really bad. It needs pieces, and those would be two pretty good pieces to add. So it's not the type of thing where I'd be angry with. I just think that in an ideal world, you'd draft a receiver early. Anyway, that's all for our show today. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. As always, if you enjoyed the show, subscribe to it. Leave it a 5-star review if you're listening on a podcast source. And please give this episode a thumbs up if you're watching on YouTube. It helps the channel out, and it helps other Jets fans find this podcast. Have a great Wednesday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.